Hey, everybody, it's Christian Pedersen, joined by Dan Dickau on another Gonzaga Nation podcast. Thanks for tuning in on a mailbag edition where we ask Dan, because literally, we have not had a single question submitted for me other than why is this guy on the show? We asked Dan the questions that you guys send in. You laughed a little too hard at that one, Dan. We asked people the questions that you guys have sent in on social media. You can hit us up at Fan Nation Zags on all the social media. You can hit Dan up at Dan Dickau 21. Dan, I, being a San Diego native, am really excited about this first question because as soon as I heard it brought up, national news wise, there's some legitimacy to this question. Person wrote in on Facebook wanting to know, can Gonzaga versus San Diego State become the premier West Coast basketball rivalry?
Wow. Good question. When you think of rivalries, at least in college basketball, the first one that comes to mind is Duke, North Carolina. It just is what it is. That's the number one rivalry that comes to mind. There are lots of other good ones, regionally, Michigan State, Indiana, Purdue. You got the Texas schools that kind of, duke it out down there. And then you got some great rivalries out of the Big East. You can go kind of almost in any direction as far as those rivalries. But when you look at the West Coast, I can't think of a truly great rivalry where it's like, set your DVR, set aside your time, you're watching this game for sure. I mean, UCLA, Arizona, yeah, they've had good games, but that hasn't really created that kind of like, hey, I'm dropping everything and watching this game. Oregon State, Washington State, those are regional rivalries. Those don't move the needle across the area. The fact that UCLA and USC are moving to the Big Ten, I don't think that creates the opportunity for UCLA and Arizona to keep that going and creating a rivalry.
I'll just stop you in saying, if you're trying to say that anybody other than USC and UCLA, like that should be the rivalry, and if you're having to reach to UCLA with another school, it's not a rivalry.
That's a good point. It should be, but USC is more relevant football wise. UCLA is more relevant baskall wise, just traditionally.
I know this question has legitimate legs. It's going to be a home and home, so it's 2 years worth of games, but this feels like both of these schools have maintained a decent upward trajectory over the last 10 plus years of basketball. Maybe Gonzaga has had more tournament prowess, is sort of the hipster non-Power 5 pick, but I don't think that SDSU is all that far behind. Certainly last year was a coming out year for them on a really high national stage. So maybe my personal follow-up is what has to happen in these 2 years of a home and home for this to become a sustained game, at least, if not, like they said, a premier rivalry on the West Coast.
Well, for anything to be a premier rivalry, I think both teams have to be traditionally good. I mean, you kind of alluded to it that Gonzaga has been elite now for some time. San Diego State has been really good for some time. And we will now see if that Final Four appearance and title game appearance last year kind of elevates them to that kind of next level of prominence. I can't say on the West Coast because true basketball people know how good they are, but maybe nationally they've still been overlooked. A lot of it is due to the style that they play. Defensively, they're unbelievably disciplined and tough and grinded out. At times, offensively, they can be hard to watch, but they get it done.
The first 1 to 45 is never a thriller on the post-game highlights.
Yeah, but when you talk about a premier rivalry, it has to be a game that is played over and over and over again and have highlight reel type endings. Kawhi Leonard and that crew came into Spokane and beat Gonzaga against Elias Harris years ago. When Gonzaga was ranked really highly. Gonzaga played down in San Diego State a few years back. Those are really kind of the only matchups that they've had that I can remember quickly over the last, 10 years or so. It's starting with a 2-year series. Hopefully both schools and both programs feel it was well worth it. And then it extends into a longer term series. And then I think at that point, if they're closely contested games, they provide excitement, then I think you can start talking about a rivalry because, at this moment in time, I don't think they've played enough consistently to make it a true rivalry. That's at least just my thoughts about it.
Let me put my tinfoil conspiracy hat on for a second and provide also that I think that these two schools maybe kind of somehow hold each other's fates in their hands in terms of long-term conference realignment or health or whatever is going on. And if they can help lift each other up into a national prominence of, oh my gosh, like you said, it's appointment television. It's wow. Saturday at 4 p.m., Gonzaga and SDSU are teeing off up in Spokane. That's going to be the ESPN game. That helps elevate both of these two in a way that leads to TV dollars. So yes, I am all for that. I think that there's no other options. Like you kind of listed off all the other schools, and there's not a second. There's no one else coming for the throne right now. So yes, I'm all in on this becoming an absolute throwdown showdown of a matchup. On to our next question.
I'm not against it either. It's just going to take a while for it to truly become a rivalry. I think it's a great 2-game series that's coming up.
It almost, I hate to say this, but it almost requires road wins from, like, I feel like Gonzaga has to win at San Diego State has to win at Gonzaga. Like there has to be bad blood. There has to be a little like fire in it. I'm absolutely with you on that front. That it
either has to be that, or it has to be games that go down to the wire and create big time finishes. Like you look at Carolina Duke. I mean, there are so many, even when one of those teams has been, banged up with injuries and or bad at times, there's iconic moments and iconic shots that you can look back and remember. Capel hits a 3, I think from like half court. Austin Rivers hits a big 3. Then you look at the UNC side with Stackhouse and that big baseline dunk against Duke. I mean, there's so many things that you memory-wise can remember about those two. So you got to have iconic shots and moments within tight games.
Hey, at least we're starting though. At least we're getting there with the games, them being played themselves. Next question that we had, and this one comes in. I think I'm still allowed to say this one comes in from Twitter. It might come in from X. I'm a little confused on the nomenclature.
I can't get used. That one is going to take me a while to get used to.
I'm going to wait till my boss tells me exactly how to introduce it on these, but they want to know who is a Gonzaga alumni or player that you have not yet had on the show that you would love to interview.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I've been able to reconnect with a lot of teammates, connect with other guys that, either came slightly before me or slightly after me, and have conversations. And we'll continue to do that as we get, closer into the season and into the season. But I think there's 2 guys, really, actually 3, that I would love to have on the podcast just to kind of, allow people to hear a little bit more of their stories, and or me get to know a little bit more about them. The first would be, Chet Holmgren. Obviously, that's an easy one for a lot of people to say they'd love to have him on a podcast. He's got a high profile where, he was just on, I think, Kevin Garnett's podcast. So, he's going to be a tougher one to get to. And the other reason he's going to be tougher to get to is simply for the fact that his 1 year at Gonzaga, they were still kind of limiting the availability to get into practice due to all COVID and all these different things. So I wasn't around practice much watching in depth that year. I mean, I was still there, but not as much as normal years that year. And then the year before with Jalen Suggs, I mean, practice availability was really limited. So I'd like to connect with him and hear more of his thoughts on the game and his time at Gonzaga. Second one would have been a teammate of mine, Roni Turioff. And if anybody that follows Gonzaga knows about Roni, they know about his infectious personality, his energy and excitement for life. But, he's a hard guy to pin down as far as where he's going to be 2 hours from now, let alone 2 days or 2 weeks from now. There was we connected a year or so back on text message, say, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast at some point, kind of talk about everything. He goes, I'd love to. I'm just too busy right now, because he's traveling the world. He's got one of the most unique jobs, as far as with the NBA. He's an ambassador for the game in the NBA. At least he did. I think he still is in that role where he's literally traveling weekly, being a part of different things.
Sounds like a great opportunity for you to say to our bosses, hey, we need a little budget. We're going to Greece to get an interview with Roni, and we might do it on a beach in Mykonos. So yes, I am down. Let's hunt him down.
And then the third one would be a guy who never got eligible at Gonzaga, but I think two things here. I think he would have been a difference maker for the teams that I was on, allowing us to go further into the NCAA tournament. But on the other hand, had he been able to play for Gonzaga, since the NCAA never ruled him eligible, Ronny Turioff probably would not have come to Gonzaga, because essentially that was his roster spot. And that would have been Mario Kassoun, 7'1", unbelievably talented. He was drafted into the NBA and played a couple of years in the NBA after basically just hanging out in Spokane and waiting for the NCAA to deem him eligible. They never did. So he was just in Spokane working out with us. That shows you how talented he is, that he never even played a game of college and he was still drafted.
I feel like that's a fun trivia answer somewhere, that like who was the Gonzaga player that wasn't a player that still made it to the NBA? I'll take that for 500, please. Last question we got. And this one, if you guys want to check out, we did another podcast this week talking a lot in depth about the new partnership with the Zags Collective. But a couple of people wanted to know, do you think Gonzaga is doing enough in the NIL space? What more could they do? Kind of a vague question, but also kind of a vague space right now. We're starting to get a little bit more idea of what this exists as in terms of concrete boundary rules and laws and how it can be applied. But it seems also like it's the right time to ask this question, given the new Zag Collective partnership that's going on.
Yeah, that is a tough question to answer, because there are always going to be people that are going to say, I want you to do more. Why aren't we doing more? Well, it's still a very new space, and figuring out and learning what works, what doesn't work, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what players may be interested in, are a few things to consider and think about. Then some of the other things, are things that can negatively impact Gonzaga. And the fact that, Gonzaga is a smaller school. I mean, if you want to just kind of split it down the middle, there's 6,000 students. Yeah, if you talk law school, you talk grad school, sometimes it's close to 7,500. If it's just undergrads, you're talking more 4,500. But if you just say 6,000, you're talking about an alumni base of a school that's essentially 6,000, maybe going up against collectives for universities that are maybe 50,000 enrollment. And so if you multiply that out by 25, 30 years, in regards to, alumni that have the ability to back NIL initiatives and programs, you are at a little bit of a disadvantage.
Yeah, the average income for a Gonzaga alum would need to be like 5 times the average income for a USC or a UNC alum or something like that.
And so that's a numbers game that you're having to overcome. But the thing is this Zags Collective is doing an unbelievable job of getting ahead of it, and I think they're going to stay ahead of it because they're being very proactive, they're being creative, and then the Gonzaga alumni and the Gonzaga fan base and the faithful and the businesses in Spokane have also stepped up to the plate, and they're continuing to step up in this new wave of college athletics and how it works. So yes, there are disadvantages, but I also think there are advantages, because Gonzaga has built such a name brand recognition, not just in Spokane, but on the West Coast. And people want to support, a program that is become elite, and they've become elite in doing it the right way.
I would also be long-term curious. You mentioned a program. We have always talked about, like with this conference realignment and some of this stuff going on, that Gonzaga not having a football program can be a bit of a hindrance in terms of them making that TV money and everything. But I will be curious long-term if Gonzaga not having a football program maybe helps level that playing field, because some of those bigger schools that you mentioned probably are splitting donors. There's probably some people being like, hey, I'd rather cut a check to the LSU football program than instead of the LSU basketball program, because I like football. When Gonzaga only has basketball, and that's the brand, and that's the only focus, and that's not just the tip of the pyramid, that's the whole thing. I'd be curious if long-term that maybe helps boost back up the numbers a little bit, because that's where people want to go with all their money, because there is nowhere else really at Gonzaga to split those donations.
You're exactly right. That's a really good point. Sometimes having another sport helps you as far as, recognition or name awareness. But I think in this case, the fact that there isn't a roster of, say 75 to 100 football players that would essentially be, dipping their toes in the same pool of NIL money. That could negatively hurt Gonzaga in this instance. Because there's no football, I think it helps Gonzaga basketball players in this instance. So you're exactly right. It's a good point to be made. I think that's something that obviously is very important in the realm of Gonzaga and the NIL.
Yeah, I'll say, like, maybe long snappers don't deserve to catch a stray here, but yeah, you don't need the Gonzaga long snapper taking $500 away from a Caden Perry or something like that in terms of appearance fees. I'll be curious to see, it's going, like you say with some of this stuff, it's going to take a while for it to all flesh out, but I will be curious to see in a couple of years when they start getting true legalized aggregate numbers where Gonzaga maybe actually ranks like on a per capita type balanced out basis. Because I would hope that, especially with stuff like this Zags collective partnership that we're launching, that the people can be there to support Gonzaga, because the enthusiasm is there in the regular season. The kennel is huge. Those kids go on to become adults. Like, they're everywhere. So I am hoping that the fans come check it all out. And you guys can all check out all the great content that we're going to be doing with the Zags collective throughout the whole year. There's going to be some huge exclusives dropping on the sooner rather than later, but as well as throughout the entire year. So make sure you follow us at Gonzaga Nation, wherever you get your podcasts, so that you never miss anything about that. And you can also go read the articles. You can follow us at Fan Nation Zags on all the social media. Until we meet again, Dan, we'll talk to you guys soon.